Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we're getting very close to completing the course now. We have just 2 lessons left. Today is going to be an interesting lesson because it's something that doesn't get emphasized that much in the West. Today we're going to be discussing the linguistic miracle of the Quran. And although I'm not going to go super in depth, I'm going to give you enough information to be able to explain to somebody who is basically Ajami or Ghayr Arab, somebody who's not Arab. They should be able to understand most of it. Somebody who is Arab will also be able to still appreciate the amount of scope that we're going to cover, inshallah ta'ala, today. We might gloss over as well some past and future prophecies mentioned in the Quran. And next week, we'll be doing our grand finale lesson, which will be proving that Islam is a solution for all of mankind, that it is the superior political and social and economic system, and will be for eternity. So that's what's coming up. So let's start with the second last lesson, inshallah, today. Bismillah. So a little bit of a recap of last week, and also maybe might be some evidences here that we didn't actually get to cover fully. I'm not going to go through each ayah, in depth or anything like that, but I just want you to have the verses in mind, and then just maybe generally know where to find them. As long as you know the keywords, it's very easy to go on Quran.com or even just on Google and just type in Quran and then just some of the words in the verse, either in Arabic or in English, and then you can quickly show these scientific signs to those who are using a more of a rational, empirical, observable, evidence-based approach to trying to ascertain that the Quran is indeed from the divine maker of the universe, and it could not have been made by a human being. So to prove its inimitability, that it could not be imitated by any human being or manufactured by a human being, having a pocket of these verses, 5 or more, should be more than sufficient to prove your case if the person you're dealing with is open and sincere. Those are the 2 main conditions. It's not that we want to set conditions, it's just that if you're dealing with somebody who's arrogant and not open-minded, then you're not going to get very far. And in that case, you're going to want to just focus on getting to the next person, because not everybody is going to be willing to listen to your da'wah. But that's why it's better to, essentially, if you were fishing, if you find that one area of the ocean, you're not getting any bites, you go to another part of the ocean, or you go during a different time of the day, so you can catch as many fish as possible. Same idea with the da'wah. You try to look at which areas are the most ripe for people who are willing to listen, that you can draw them in to the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal, which is a deen of najah, a deen of salvation. So some scientific ayat, we said in the book, The Quran Project, you're going to find probably at least 40 different scientific ayat. It's a short PDF. You can download it by just Googling the keywords in Quran Project PDF on Google. But some of the signs you'll come across is orbiting celestial bodies. It was not known until very late, let's just say in this millennia, that the sun and all the planets have their own unique orbits. We said before that before Nicholas Copernicus, people used to think that the Earth was the center of the solar system. They call it the geocentric model. Nicholas Copernicus was the first person to challenge that. The Christians, they considered him an apostate, a heretic, a kafir basically, threw him in prison and just basically waited for him to rot to his demise. So that's how the Christian church dealt with him. So obviously it wasn't the main school of thought, you could say, to believe that the universe, sorry, not the universe, this solar system that we're living in right now is actually heliocentric. That was not the predominant view at the time. Now it's basically established science that in our solar system, i.e. the 8 planets and the sun, and we're the 3rd rock or the Earth from the sun. So for us, we know that the sun is actually the center of all the orbiting planets around us within this solar system. So this is verified in Surah Zumar. Iron descending to the earth. Modern day scientists, so this is obviously within the last 100 years or so, they have said that iron, and we're talking about non-Muslim scientists, they've said that iron did not originate on the earth. I understand that there is iron in the core of the earth, but they say it didn't originate here. They say that this iron came down from meteorites or some other type of asteroid, celestial body, and descended down to the earth. And Allah alludes to this in Surah Al-Hadid, where He explains to us that this hadid, this iron, actually descended to the earth. So again, Islam is continuously lining up perfectly with established scientific facts and laws. We don't really care about theories. We're not going to waste our time with that, as we discussed last week. We're going to focus on what we can observably prove that already lines up with the Quran. Then the idea that the Earth's atmosphere is a protection in Surah Al-Anbiya. And last week we talked about how important the atmosphere really is, how it blocks out probably more than 95% of all UV radiation. Had it not done that, we would have roasted to a crisp. And at the same time, the reason why we don't need the sun during nighttime is because the atmosphere also works as a blanket, as well as all the asymmetrical molecules such as water vapor, which makes up a large portion of the atmosphere, which helps to bounce back some of the heat that has reached the Earth so that we don't all freeze over. So we can see that the atmosphere is extremely important for the protection of the Earth. And what I probably didn't discuss last week is you'll probably find more information on the NASA website, or if you just Google and YouTube solar flares and Earth's protection. You're going to find that had it not been for the atmosphere that we have, the solar flare, any solar flare, if it was to reach Earth, so what happens is the sun has these moments where it just lashes out a big, I guess like a gust of fire, basically. It reaches out further than just the regular radiation. So when these flares of fire come out of the sun, some of them, they reach so close to the Earth that had there been no atmosphere, again, we would have burnt to a crisp. But there's also another interesting thing is that the Earth has something which is called the magnetosphere. And this is just showing the fine tuning of how Allah Azza wa Jal created this universe. So the same iron that He sent down creates the magnetosphere, which is basically a type of force field that prevents almost all the damage of the solar flares. So that's another layer of protection that Allah Azza wa Jal has granted to us on this Earth that other planets don't have this fine tuning. But we can see the Earth was very particularly set in terms of its distance, in terms of having an atmosphere, having a magnetosphere. Everything was perfect for the conditions for life to exist. Intelligent design argument is the point here, that we're saying this is just too good to be coincidence, is what we're trying to say. Female bees are the worker bees. For a long time, science believed that all the worker bees were male, because they thought, the female bee, the queen bee, it makes sense that the big queen bee is female because she's having babies. And generally speaking, that's what we think babies come from females. So the general belief for 1,000+ years in science was that all the worker bees are all male. But late established science has proved, and Dr. Zakir Naik does mention this in his 2-hour+ video on scientific science in the Quran. He mentions that now we know that we have actually the main worker bee, they're actually all female. And if you go on Google, you'll find there's mainly 3 classes of bees. There's the drone bee, which is the male bee, and they don't need actually many of these in the hive. You could be fine with just one of them. Really the goal of the male drone bee is not to pollinate, not to collect honey, and it has no stinger. So it can't really defend the hive, nor can it bring in pollen and create honey for the hive. So all it really can do is help to procreate with the female queen. So really that's the only job, is to assist the queen in having children, or larvae if you prefer a more scientific term. And then the vast bulk of what exists in the hive is the female worker bee. So not the male drone bee, but the female worker bee that has a stinger. And this is what the Quran is alluding to, that the worker bee is actually female. So if you go to the ayah, you'll see that it's mentioned in the feminine, and this is absolutely correct. So we're saying, look at the fine detail that Allah Azza wa Jal is using in the Quran. These are things that, if you were to ask the Arabs in the 14th century, they would have just glossed over this entirely. They would have saw the ayah, they would have appreciated it for its linguistic capacity. But these layers of science is something that really we can only come to appreciate, and those who basically lived in the last 200 years. Because other than that, science and the information age didn't really skyrocket until the last 200 years or so. High altitudes affect breathing. You wouldn't know unless you were up there. So now we have airplanes, and now we have specialized breathing equipment so people can actually venture up to the top of Mount Everest. But this is something that the Quran is also alluding to, that at high altitudes, it's not going to be the same quality of oxygen. Again, what are we showing here? We're showing consistently that the Quran is accurate in proving observable evidence. The atheist prides himself in saying that they believe in only things that are observable. We're saying, look at the 1,000 plus scientific ayat in the Quran that are observable. Tell me any other source that claims to be God and explains the entire code of life other than Islam in the Quran, and does it without any mistakes. And there's no other religion. So therefore, you have no choice if you're sincere and open, but to narrow down to one path. Somebody might say, well, what about this religion, that? Try, look, take a look and see what you find. You're not going to find that any other religion can make this claim. Not even, unfortunately, the previous books of scripture. So for example, the Bible is filled with scientific inaccuracies. For example, it says to use blood as a disinfectant. We know that blood is actually one of the main agents for delivering disease to others. Now, we don't claim that the Bible is perfectly preserved, and the Bible itself, as we mentioned, Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8, says that it's been tampered with by the Jews. So the point is that even for those previous scriptures, they're not to this level of standard. We need to point that out in case somebody says, well, I want to see what the Old Testament or New Testament says. I have a special feeling towards it or something like that. We would still remind them that the only book that is perfectly preserved and lacks zero mistakes would be the Quran. And therefore, you can maybe use the analogy of a computer. We know with computers, especially if you own Windows, alhamdulillah I have a Mac, but if you have Windows, especially Windows, you'll notice that you get a ton of viruses. So they always coming up with like Norton antivirus and then patches for like the latest Windows. I don't know what it is now. What's that? Is it Windows 10 or something after that now? Whatever it is, there's like updates almost on a monthly basis, because if you're not up to date, then your computer is prone to viruses and can be basically destroyed. So with the Quran, we can say that the Quran is literally like the final update. There will be no more need for updates, and there will be no viruses or contaminations that will occur with this scripture. And this is from Allah's justice and Allah's mercy that He would ensure that the final scripture is perfectly preserved, because if it wasn't, then we couldn't say for sure 100% what we're supposed to do. And we might have to, some people might make this argument on the Day of Judgment. I was not given a perfectly preserved book, so how would I know what to follow? That argument would not stand, because we know that the Quran has been perfectly preserved and it's accurate. Pupils dilate when lying. There's a lot of research out there as to what happens when a person lies. There's also another ayah, you guys remember, the one that talks about an-nasiya, the forelock, which is referring to how Abu Jahl had a lying forelock, which is mentioned in Surah Al-Alaq. The scientists and neurologists, they are now saying that they don't know for sure everything that causes lying, but there's a couple things that they know. So one of them would be the issue of the eyes dilating. Another thing is that specifically the frontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain, it gets very stimulated when somebody's lying, because they're trying to come up with a story of something that's not true. So this nasiya is the same area. It's the front part of the brain. So basically, even though Arabic and English are two different languages, we're talking about the same area. A nasiya and the prefrontal cortex is the front of the brain, and then therefore we see a match between what Allah is telling us about the lying sinful forelock and the area in the brain which commits to lying. And you can look at the other signs as you wish. Some of the people in this room have actually watched maybe half the video series of the 2-hour series with Dr. Zakir Naik. I highly recommend these two resources if you want to go down the route of using scientific ayat to prove your point, but also it's just nice and refreshing to your iman just to see how many signs. So that way, if shaitan ever came to you and gave you any type of shak, any type of doubt, any type of waswas, you could just tell shaitan, where do I start? Like, do I start with the 100th proof or the 1000th proof? Right? Like shaitan would just have to, shut his mouth and just walk away at that point. Because you're so heavily armored with evidences, there's no way you can be intellectually disproven at this point. We talked about this sign already. I'm not sure why I originally put this slide in one more time. Maybe it was just as a reminder, but I think it was just to point out the historical accuracy of the Quran. If you recall, this slide was talking about how during the time of Yusuf alayhi salam in the Old Kingdom, the word for Fir'aun did not mean a king. It actually referred to a great palace. So that's in 3000 200 BC before Christ, or BCE before Common Era, for those who don't want to use the religious terminology. And then in the New Kingdom, we're going into the future now, to only 1580 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, Isa alayhi salam, is that during Musa alayhi salam's time, then the word Fir'aun did mean a king. And there is a distinguishment clearly in the Quran where al-Malik is used to refer to the king of the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, and Fir'aun is the word that's used during the time of Musa alayhi salam. And we only knew this subtlety, I'm saying from non-Muslim sources, when the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799. If you look at the previous slides, you'll see that had it not been for this massive rock that had Greek, Phoenician, and hieroglyphics on it, then we would not have been able to decipher the hieroglyphics, and we would never have seen this level of detail that the Quran is again showing its consistent accuracy with. I think the clicker is getting better now. It's getting more sensitive, which is great, alhamdulillah, because it only took like 10 lessons to do that, but it's progress, alhamdulillah. So if you remember, when we talked about Surah Al-Rum, we spoke about in the first 2 to 3 ayat how the Byzantines and the Persians, so the Romans and the Persians, they would fight in the lowest land. And we found out that the Dead Sea Rift Valley, which is an area in Palestine, is the lowest altitude below sea level on the face of the earth that you can walk on. And that's proven by satellite technology, and that's where they had a battle. But in addition to that, in those opening ayat of Surah Al-Rum, it also discusses how the Romans at that time, they had just been hit with a heavy blow. They had almost been defeated by the Persians. That's why if anybody made a prediction, like if this was like a football, what do you call those? Is it football lottery or football, that thing that they always do? They guess who's going to win the cup or something like that. No, the thing where like, I don't know, unfortunately, it's some type of gambling thing, I think, where people, they vote on what team they think is going to win the championships. Something like that. So anyways, if somebody was to make a bet on this, it's kind of like, imagine it's like your chances of winning are like 1% or less than 1%. Like anybody would laugh at you if you were to say that the Romans could make a comeback after the Persians, after what they did during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But the Quran came down at that time when everybody would have laughed at the idea of this happening from the kuffar, from their perspective. And then Allah told them that it would happen within 3 to 9 years. Now, the word in Arabic just means 3 to 9, so just that's the reason for it saying 3 to 9. And within 6 to 8 years of this being revealed in Surah Al-Rum, it was fulfilled that the Romans indeed defeated the Persians. Adn al-Ardi definitely means the lowest. I mean, nearest could be another translation, but the point is now we're focusing on a different miracle altogether. So lowest was the first thing we wanted to look at. The second thing here is we're talking about the timeline. So I'll just fix the translation because, as you guys know, with Quran translations, there's a lot of differences. So I probably just copied and pasted from a different translation, but I'll just try to make it consistent, inshallah, for future courses, inshallah ta'ala. But now we have both the time prophecy as well as the depth prophecy within these opening ayat of Surah Al-Rum, the chapter of the Romans. Then we have, and I know it's kind of hard to see the top of the projector here, now we're talking about the doom destined for Abu Lahab. So it was considered a pretty bold statement at the time for the Quran to say that Abu Lahab, for sure, him and his wife are going to be in hell. Because it was early in the Wahy, it was in Mecca. And at any time, if Abu Lahab just wanted to cause fitna, he could have caused a huge fitna. All he would have to do is literally just pretend to be Muslim for one day. If he did that, then it would be a challenge directly with this ayah. But Allah knew, because Allah is Al-Alim, that Abu Lahab is never even going to pretend to be a Muslim. So therefore, this ayah came down very early in the revelation in the Meccan seerah, and it stayed firm, right? Because Abu Lahab never pretended or sincerely ever accepted Islam. And obviously he was a major enemy of Islam ever since he found out that Islam was a religion that people could follow. So that's the point here, is that Allah is showing us that He knows the future and to every subtle detail. That's the point we're trying to mention here. So now we're going to get to the point of how is the Quran considered a miracle on its own? And it's important for us to know that the Quran is a miracle because it's the fact that it's something that's tangible. We can actually pick it up and read it. While as the previous miracles, Isa alayhi salam, he lived in a time when people mostly had illnesses and sickness. So most of Isa alayhi salam's miracles are about healing the sick. People who have leprosy, somebody who's blind. There was a person who technically he brought somebody back to life, obviously by the permission of Allah, but it's all usually based on health issues. And then in the case of Musa alayhi salam, sihr, sorcery was the big thing at that time. So most of his miracles basically show that Allah's power is way greater than the power of working with the jinn and the sihr that they try to produce. And with the Quran, it's considered a linguistic miracle. We've talked about the science aspect so far. So now we're going to discuss that on 5 different levels or dimensions at least, the Quran shows that it is at the top in terms of language. So one of them is the letter sounds, so phonics. So those, especially those who already know the Arabic language very well, they will notice that verses that talk about rahmah have soft letters being used with them. And verses that talk about something that's harsh, they will use the rougher or the harder letters, and even just the way that the words are put together will be more piercing. So like we said, for example, in sort of takwir, it kind of sounds like something is kind of moving around. There's a lot of commotion because it's talking about the day of judgment. So it makes sense that that would be the context. If you look at sort of Duha, you'll notice that there's a lot of madud, there's a lot of like elongation in the surah. And the idea is here is that like the Prophet ﷺ, he was basically, he didn't have the guidance of Islam prior to knowing it. And then it's like Allah is sending this long call of mercy to help him in the midst of a society that was completely misguided. So there's like these meanings that are inculcated within just the sounds of the ayat. And obviously, the more you know Arabic, the more you can appreciate this. Then the best word choice, so in sarf, morphology. For example, last week we said how there's a difference between kathir, kathiran, and kawthar. Kawthar is like the most of something. And that was the best word to explain Allah's giving abundance to the Prophet ﷺ. And this could literally mean different types of khayr. It could mean having the highest level of Jannah, being in Firdaus al-Ala, being at the highest place, having the station of Maqam al-Mahmud on the Day of Judgment, being a shafi', being the intercessor over the entire ummah. It could have meant the fact that he is the Ashraf al-Mursaleen. He is the chief of all the prophets, and so many other things that it could mean. But basically the ayah was showing that Allah has given the Prophet ﷺ so much of so many different things, and therefore Kawthar was without a doubt the best word. I'm just giving you one example, but the point is the whole Quran is based on using the best word choice. And when we looked at examples like, for example, the bee, and we were talking about where the honey is, we said that the word batuniha means within the stomach, but also within inside the enclosed space, which means all the meanings are correct. Or when we looked at the word alaq, that means a leech-like thing, that's a blood clot, that's hanging or suspended, and the early embryology in the first 3 weeks ticks all the boxes for this exact meaning, all of the meanings encapsulated in the Arabic word which was used. And as also with the case of mughda and obviously many other words. Then you have the overall meanings of the verses. So some of the verses are just mind-blowing, just like the rhetorical devices that are being used and the depth of meaning. There are people who try to make things like the Quran, but one of the main things that they lacked in is deep meaning. They can make things sound like the Quran, but it would be lacking, especially in this area. And then in terms of nahu and balagha, those are the other 2 elements, the Quran ended up becoming a main reference point for how to understand Arabic grammar. And if you ask people who speak the Arabic language, they'll tell you this, that the Quran actually became sort of like a standard on how to understand nahu and qa'idah. So that's the status of the Quran in terms of grammar. And balagha, this has to do with the poetic expressions. So we're going to see a slide eventually, which I kind of alluded to this like a week or 2 ago, that if you just took the first two sentences of a rap from Eminem. I think it's when he literally claimed to be a rap god. And then you compare it with just 3 words of Surah Al-Kawthar, then you'll find that there are 20 rhetorical devices, 20 forms of balagha, 20 types of poetic structure that are built into just the first 3 words of Surah Al-Kawthar, and yet an Eminem song in 2 sentences could only come up with 2. So, big difference. Again, we're showing the immaculate precision and the nature and the depth of the Quran and why it's a linguistic miracle. And we're going to look at some examples now, inshallah. So, we have something in the Quran also which is called a palindrome. A palindrome is if you can take a word or a sentence and if you can basically spell it out, and if you were to read it backwards, you could say the exact same word. That's a palindrome. So, for example, the word taco cat. If you tried to read it backwards, you'd have all the same letters. So, if you go forwards, T-A-C-O-C-A-T, and if you go backwards, T-A-C-O-C-A-T. So you see it's like a mirror image of each other. So like O in this case is the middle letter, and there's a reflection on both sides of the other letters. This is what a palindrome is. So aphophobia, read it backwards, it would be the same word. Or even weird sentences like Mr. Owl ate my metal worm. Most people wouldn't say that unless you really want to write a science fiction novel or a fiction novel about Mr. Owl eating a metal worm. But normally, the point is like it's kind of a weird sentence. Same thing with like, Eva, can I stab bats in a cave? Unless you're, I don't know, doing some kind of like a bat hunter fiction novel, that might work. But normally, that would be kind of weird. And there are a lot of individual words that are palindromes, but not full sentences with deep meaning. So you can see words like kayak, 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 race car, reviver level, so rotor, rotor. So you get the idea here. But what these all lack in the English language, as well as other languages, is that they don't make deep, meaningful sentences, except in the case of the Quran and obviously using the Arabic language, which we'll take a look at now. So, if you look into the Quran, you will see that the Quran uses palindromes, but for complete ideas, phrases, or sentences, rather than just one individual word. So 2 examples of this is in Surah Al-Mudaththir, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. So, and your Lord magnify. So that obviously has deep meaning, but it also has a palindrome, and it's more than one word. So we can say this is a series of words, a phrase, or like a sentence. And then also, وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ. But each is in an orbit, swimming. So now we're talking about the celestial bodies. And what's interesting here is that I remember one brother from I3 Institute, his name is Riyadh Muslim. He explained that not only do we have a palindrome here, but think about this. It's saying that each of them, like the celestial bodies, has an orbit swimming around it. So what is an orbit? We said, remember before, that the sun is in the center of a solar system and has the planets orbiting around it. So you look at the Alaf Maksura in the middle here of the ayah, and it's surrounded by 2 fas orbiting around it, 2 lambs orbiting around that, and 2 calves orbiting around that. So there's even a visual representation of the orbit that's happening here in this ayah. This is pretty deep stuff. And again, this just kind of goes with spending more time with the Quran and trying to look for these interesting features within the Quran. But it just goes to show like the Quran is multidimensional. We're saying that it's the best in terms of, like we said before, grammar structure, sarf, morphology, word structure, phonemes, but even things like making palindromes, making special patterns where there's a reflection of the letters and then still giving deep meaning, which you can't do in other languages, or it's never been done, basically. Then we have an interesting feature called ring structure. And I don't know really of anybody who's really talked about this other than mainly English speakers. I mean, there could be some Arabic scholars who talked about this in the past, but I've known that this is something that a lot of Western scholars, they try to bring up, this idea that either it's individual ayat or usually it's clusters of ayat, that if you take the first cluster of a surah, let's say 20 ayat, and the last 20 ayat or so, you'll find they're talking about the exact same theme. And the same thing will happen for the second portion and the second last portion, the third portion and the third last portion, fourth and then fourth last, all the way to the middle. An example of this is in Surah Al-Baqarah. So it's in Surah Al-Baqarah, the first 20 ayat and then the ending ayat of the Quran talk about iman versus kufr, faith versus unbelief or disbelief. And then the next two sections, the second section and the second last, talks about God's creation and His knowledge over all things. And then it talks about, in the third section, and the third last, talks about the difference in law. The law that was given to Musa alayhi salam and the law given to the Muslims. And then the section on being tested is the next fourth and the fourth last. And then what's interesting when you get to the middle is it talks about the Kaaba and that there has to be a shift in direction of where people need to be in terms of their faith. We know this was a turning point for those who were true believers, that if they really believed, that they would turn towards the Kaaba. What's also interesting that if you go to the middle ayah of the Quran, of Surah Al-Baqarah, so Surah Al-Baqarah is 286 ayat. You go exactly to the middle verse and it's talking about the middle. Now, a lot of this stuff, the reason why it's so interesting is that in many cases, the Quran came down in huge sections. When we look at the case of Surah Yusuf, so Surah Yusuf follows the same ring pattern, and Surah Yusuf came down all in one shot, just so you're aware. So when we look at that next, you'll see why this is kind of mind-boggling. I think actually before we even get to that, we have to get to Ayatul Kursi. And also there's something else interesting about Surah Al-Baqarah. So the ring structure that I just showed you on the previous slide, each of those sections, those color-coded sections, there's a ring inside of each of those rings. So that means there's another theme inside of those themes, and that's for all the sections, by the way. And then inside of that ring, there's yet another ring for Ayatul Kursi. So you have rings upon even a third level of a ring. So the third level is the example of Ayatul Kursi. And when we get to Ayatul Kursi, we find that even though it's just one ayah, it technically has like 9 main parts or 9 major ideas. But the first idea in the ayah and the 9th idea, they match in the meaning. What's the matching point here? Asma al-Husna, the beautiful names of Allah and His attributes. And then the second and the second last part has to do with the fact that Allah is Al-Qayyum and He doesn't get tired, right? So لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. So there's nothing that can overpower Allah. He never gets tired. He never loses His energy. So the second part and the second last part have the same meaning. This concept is in the third section and the third last section. So you can see the pattern, the theme of having control over the heavens and the earth, both mentioned in the third and third last section of just this one ayah within a ring, within another ring of the ring structure. And then obviously the bi'idhnillah, by things being done by His permission. And then Allah knows everything that happens before and after. And interestingly, this is put in the middle of the ayah. Allah says what's before and after, and there's a reflection of what's before and after in every other section of this ayah. Like this is pretty in-depth stuff. For this to just come down randomly, or for the Prophet to just coincidentally, for the Prophet to just come up with this, all these linguistic features and scientific features, is it even rational for this to be possible? It's not rational for somebody to say that the Prophet could have guessed all this, all these linguistic features existed, all these scientific features that existed, and there was no mistakes and no contradictions, and it was perfectly preserved, and it just happened for somebody to claim that just happened by chance. Are you nuts? Obviously they're nuts. That's what they're going to claim. So now we look at Surah Yusuf. So Surah Yusuf alayhi salam, he was a brother amongst how many brothers? Anybody know? 12, right? So he's one out of the 12. And the argument has been made, and it's obviously empirically proven here, is that you can take Surah Yusuf and you can divide it into 12 parts, just like how he was one of 12 brothers. And then what's also interesting is whatever happens in the first section happens in the last section. So what happened in the first section of Surah Yusuf? It talks about how Yusuf alayhi salam had a dream. What does it talk about in the last section of the surah? It says that Yusuf, his dream has been interpreted. Remember the dream about the sun and the moon, and they were prostrating towards him. And so we're talking about this dream. And then the brothers plot against Yusuf. That's the second part of the surah. And then the second last part, the brothers, they learn the lesson for doing this plot to Yusuf alayhi salam. The third section, the minister's wife attempts to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam. This is referring to Zulaykha, the woman who was Al-Aziz's wife. And then in the third last section, she confesses that she committed this sin of trying to seduce him. So notice the commonality of themes here, the mirror imaging that's happening in this ring structure. Then in the fourth section, it says a similar attempt by Egyptian women. And we know, remember the women, when they saw Yusuf alayhi salam, Zulaykha told them to hold an apple and just to carve an apple with a knife. They saw Yusuf alayhi salam and they cut their hands because they were just, just mesmerized by the beauty of Yusuf alayhi salam. We're supposed to have half the beauty of this entire dunya. And then in the fourth last section, those same ladies confess of whatever it is that they, what was going on with them. And then the fifth section, Yusuf's imprisonment. The fifth last section, Yusuf is freed from prison. The sixth section and the sixth last section, the king had a dream and his dream was interpreted. So notice the mirror imaging, even the diagram makes it very obvious how if you just look up and down, the parallels that are happening here within this surah. This is another example of ring structure. Then we have this again in Surah Buruj. In Surah Buruj, I actually just attached the YouTube link for it, but it's the exact same idea. First ayah, last ayah. So if it's talking about like Allah's names and attributes, then you're going to see reflection. Whatever the thing is, if it's about punishment or whatever the themes are, I don't want to go into all the detail, but if you want to watch it, the link is provided within the PowerPoint. Just click on it. It's Numan Ali Khan doing the same thing that I just told you about. Look, comparing the first section to the last, second to the second last, and so forth. So, Surah Al-Kawthar, we said, I kind of already discussed this already enough as it is. So the point here is that these are just some examples of the rhetorical devices we're talking about in just Surah Al-Kawthar. The fact that it has the best word choice, that it uses the past tense for emphasis, it uses emphatic particles, it uses grammatic shift, special usage of pronouns, special word arrangement, multiple meanings within words. It uses hyperbole, which is basically an exaggerated form of speech. So these are just types of poetic devices. When we say rhetorical devices or poetic devices, this is what I'm talking about. Things that would, if you were in an English class and you were doing what's called, creative writing, or you're doing composition, and you have to write stuff that makes your essay pop or your story more intriguing, this is what I'm talking about. So the fact that in Surah Al-Kawthar, if I'm not mistaken, it's, did we say 40 rhetorical devices? 20? The point is, it's a whole lot, way more than like anything in any other language in a very short period of time. How many in the first three letters? Okay, well the point is, it's a lot. And there's a video actually, I attached the link, it's by Imran ibn Mansour. He actually goes through a whole bunch of the specifics. So if you want to watch the video on that, feel free to do so. So, do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from any other than God, you would have found within it much contradiction. The point is, the Quran does not have contradictions. If somebody says, but the ayat of Khamr, Allah didn't forbid it immediately, that doesn't mean it's a contradiction. It just means that some ayat, they have like stages, what you would call tadarruj, gradualism. So if Allah slowly increases or decreases the intensity of a ruling, it's not a contradiction. And those who understand the Quran and understand when it was revealed, they would know that. This is part of anybody who basically is a mufassir, a scholar of tafsir, they have to study asbab al-nuzul, the reasons and the incidences of when ayats were revealed, so they can understand the principle of nasikh wa mansukh. So which ayah abrogated which in terms of applicability. So no ayah is actually being deleted in the case of what we're looking at here. We're saying that the verses are basically, there's a chronological order to them, and you have to study the science of this. But if you know this science, it's very obvious this is not a contradiction. The fact that Allah said, don't come to the prayer drunk, and then at one point He just completely prohibited it, it's not a contradiction because we know that these happen in chronological steps. We have both Quranic and Hadith evidence to support this, as well as the statements of the Sahaba, like Aisha, who explains this process of tadarruj and said, had Allah Azza wa Jal revealed the prohibition of alcohol in one shot, the people would not have accepted it. So she even gives you the hikmah, or at least one of the hikam, the wisdoms as to why this tadarruj, this gradualism occurs, at least in this case of khamr in the Quran. Now we're going to look at what some non-Muslims, as well as Muslims, had to say about the linguistic structure of the Quran. So rather than me trying to claim like I can divulge into all the specific examples and proofs, why don't we just listen to what some scholars have to say, both Muslim and non-Muslim, and see what did they have to say after their analysis of the Quran. So let's start with a non-Muslim, Bruce Lawrence, on his book, The Quran, a biography, Atlantic Books. So he says, as tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth, that they signify meaning layered with meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. It's kind of like what we've been trying to discuss for the last few weeks, that you can look at a few set of ayat and find multiple different proofs within those ayat, on top of the fact that maybe these verses are just giving specific instructions to the Muslims. But on top of that, you can get ring structure. On top of that, you can get special rhetorical devices. On top of that, you can get scientific evidences, historical prophecies, futuristic prophecies, like all this in depth, palindromes, mathematical patterns. Like there's just so many layers of depth to what the Quran has to offer. Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, sorry, not al-Razi. Yeah, it is. It is Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi. So Imam al-Sayyuti, he narrates him an al-Itqan, the perfection fi ulum al-Quran, of the sciences of the Quran. And he writes, or he's quoting Imam Fakhruddin, where he said, it is inimitable, meaning you cannot make something like the Quran because of its balagha, its eloquence, its unique style, its usloob, and because it is free from any error, as we've discussed previously. And then we look at a non-Muslim, some guy named H.A.R. Gibb would be his last name. And in 1980, writing for the Oxford University Press, he writes, like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of language and rhetoric. Well then, if the Quran were his own composition, meaning the Prophet ﷺ, other men could rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it. If they could not, and it is obvious that they could not, then let them accept the Quran as an outstanding evidential miracle. So even a non-Muslim is explaining that what did we find? That when the Muslims were spreading the message of Islam, is that the Quraysh didn't waste a lot of time trying to challenge the Quran because it didn't go anywhere. Had it been possible, then the debate would have ended a long time ago. There would have been no war of swords. There would have been no clash of the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Uhud and the Battle of Ahzab and all the other ghazawat that happened if it wasn't for the fact that they could not compete with the Quran. And pretty much by ijma, everybody agrees that 1400 years ago, during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, that is when the people were at the apex of the Arabic language. There was a sheikh who came to London, I think a few days ago, to give a tafsir of Surah Al-Fatiha. His name is Sheikh Mu'tasim Al-Hamidi from Abu Huraira, the masjid in Toronto. And he explained that he thought that the Arabs of today should be able to understand 70 to 80% of whatever's in the Quran, just based on them knowing the Arabic language already. But then he studied sarf in detail. And sarf, we said, you look at each word and all the multiplicity of meanings in each word of the Arabic language in the classical fusha. And after he did that, and he compared it to like the basic Ammiya, that the dialects that Arabs speak, he said, after looking at this, now I'm going to say 10%. 10% of whatever a person born speaking Arabic knows, if they compare it to the fine details of knowing what everything means in the Quran, only 10% of comprehension. That's what he's basically trying to get at. Let's hope, but you'd be surprised. Some people, they know things are the truth, but because of pressure, social status, culture, they don't accept Islam or they keep it hidden. There's a lot of conspiracy theories online about things like people in the royal family in Britain, like undercover Muslims, and I don't want to get into all the details. The point is, Allahu Alam, if people do it undercover or not. We know Najashi, during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, he was Muslim. And there's a hadith that indicates he is from the people of paradise. Just bil ma'na, the hadith, because I don't know word for word, but I know the Prophet ﷺ indicated in some form of wording that he's going to basically be from the people of paradise. Najashi, the king of, of Ethiopia. He did accept Islam, but he kept it a secret. It wasn't public. And why was it in public? Is because the Christian priests and the bishops and the ministers around him did not accept Islam, and there was the fear that they were going to overthrow him. So that's the reason. And if anybody's ever prayed what's called Salat al-Ghaib, you pray for somebody who's not present. Say somebody dies in an airplane, they die on a ship, or they just die in the wilderness, and you don't have access to the body. What do people do? The scholars, they say you pray Salat al-Janaza, but they call it Salat al-Ghaib. You're praying for the body that's not actually physically in front of you, right? You're not praying to the body, you're praying for the body. So the point is you're asking Allah to forgive the deceased. The Prophet ﷺ, the only hadith that we have that I'm aware of on Salat al-Ghaib is about Najashi. So he was the person that they didn't have access to his body. So if they prayed over him like a Muslim, then it's kind of obvious he's a Muslim. You don't pray Salat al-Janaza on non-Muslims. So this is an interesting qawl, an interesting quote, because Al-Walid al-Mughira, so he's the father of Khalid ibn Walid, but he's not just the father of Khalid ibn Walid, he was the greatest poet of Quraysh. So, and he was one of the greatest enemies of Quraysh, and he was from the chieftains. It was like, well, he was considered like the wise guy, what you would call Dar al-Nadwa. Dar al-Nadwa was like the political system that existed in Mecca when they were trying to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ and spread propaganda about him, to call him a sahir, a magician, a kahin, a fortune teller, or to claim that he was majnoon, to claim that he'd gone crazy. And then they came up with this idea that actually was Al-Walid ibn Mughira that suggested that if you hear the Quran, it's a type of sihr. If you hear the Quran, he claimed it will destroy, bonds between family members. That was the false claim that he made. But the same Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, Allah, He actually speaks very harshly against him in the Quran. But the thing which interesting is about Al-Walid is that even though he was a major enemy of Islam, from the top enemies, he was considered like the wise guy in the political system of Dar al-Nadwa within Mecca, within the Meccan Seerah, and he was the person who came up with the propaganda of say that the Quran is a type of sihr, because they realized that attacking the Prophet's character by using ad hominems on him, by trying to attack his personality, the fact that he was a Sadiq al-Amin wasn't working. That's why they came up with something else. But what did this person, being such a top enemy of Islam, what did he have to say about the Quran? These are words you wouldn't expect to hear from somebody who is one of the biggest enemies of the whole Islamic da'wah during the lifetime of the Prophet. What did he have to say? So he said, and what can I say? For I swear by Allah, Azza wa Jal, or subhanahu wa ta'ala, I can't really read the script because it's kind of small there. There is none amongst you who knows poetry as well as I do, nor can any compete with me in composition or rhetoric, not even in the poetry of the jinns. And yet I swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Muhammad's speech, meaning the Quran, does not bear any similarity to anything I know. And I swear by Allah, the speech that he says is very sweet and it is adorned with beauty and charm. He's admitting, he's saying that he doesn't know of anyone, of all basically of Quraysh and Mecca, anybody who can compete with him in poetry. Yet the Quran is beyond the ability of human beings and jinn. SubhanAllah, how this person didn't become Muslim. Because if you asked that question earlier about one of the other guys, one of the Orientalists, did he become Muslim? Al-Walid ibn Mughira said this and he didn't become Muslim. I don't know what level of insincerity you need to have to not accept Islam, but that's why I said, when you give da'wah, you have so many proofs, 1,000+ proofs you can give. If somebody doesn't accept Islam, it's only because they're insincere and they're not open to the truth. That's it. Simple as that. It's not that you didn't have enough evidence. It's just they are, their nafs overrode their will to, sami'na wa ata'na, obey Allah Azza wa Jal and His Messenger, or shaitans playing games with them. The point is that they deep down inside, these people know what the truth is, but because of social pressure or some kind of cultural, economic pressure, they just don't submit. That's usually what ends up happening. And so we're going to wrap up today's lesson 12 minutes prior to the iqama with 5 questions. Well, it depends how long we're going to take with these, but let's see if you guys can remember the answers to these quick questions to sum up the lesson. So what is, sorry for the typo, what is, or what's supposed to be, what is ring structure in the Quran? Go ahead.
Some surahs where you have an event or a theme in the first part of the surah, and that's repeated in the last part.
Yes.
The second part, that's repeated in the second last part, and so on and so forth until in the entire surah is that.
Correct. So you have a ring structure, or you have a mirror image of the first and last, second part, second last, third part, third last, of the same themes or ideas being repeated within the surah. And that this pattern exists on top of the fact that all these ayat are giving all these rich meanings, and you're getting the balagha, you're getting the nahu, you're getting the sarf, you're getting just so many things within each ayah. Question 2, what is the name of one of the surahs that has ring structure in it? We discussed 3 of them. Surah Al-Baqarah, and then we also talked about Surah Al-Yusuf and Surah Al-Buruj. Question 3, how many rhetorical devices are used in the 10 words that make up Surah Al-Kawthar? So now my brain is a little, I think I know what it is, but what do you guys think? So I actually think it's 40, but it's been a little while since I looked at this, so I think I'm going to have to rewatch the video, but I'm pretty sure it's 40 rhetorical devices if you take the first 10 words. 4T. If you take the whole surah is just 10 words, right? So within the whole surah, inshallah it's 40, but I'll double check that, and we have the link still in the PowerPoint. Question 4, who from the greatest enemies of the kuffar who we just talked about, from Mecca, admitted that the Quran is beyond the speech of mankind and jinn? Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, the father of Khalid ibn Walid. Obviously Khalid ibn Walid accepted Islam, but unfortunately his father did not. Question 5, if the Quran and Bible are both from Allah, then why is there contradictions in the current Bible and not in the Quran? It's corrupted by people, and it said that it was corrupted by people, and Allah did not promise that He would protect the previous revelation. That promise is only for the Quran. This obviously helps us to narrow down what is acceptable to be taken as an instruction manual for how human beings should live their life. So hopefully, inshallah, you guys took benefits from that. We only have one lesson left, which will be about proving that Islam is the perfect social, political, economic system, and evidences to support that. And that will wrap up the Fiqh of Da'wah course next week. After we finish the next week's lesson, all that's left, aside from the one assignment I asked for, the half page to 1 page assignment during the course for those who are accredited students, is the multiple choice exam. And it's either 40 or 50 multiple choice questions on Google Forms. I will post it on the Google Classroom. It will probably not even take you 30 minutes. And once you're done, it's auto-graded, so you'll automatically get your mark, and that's the other 50% of your grade. So you can take your first mark, which I may not have marked all the essays or assignments. I'm a very easy marker. So just so you know that in this course, and inshallah in the next course that I'm going to be offering, I think in September, which is going to be the Heroes of Islam, we're going to go through 20 of the major heroes. We're going to go through Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. We're going to go look at Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Imam Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Izzuddin ibn Abdul Salam, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Khalid ibn Walid, and there's some other names in there, but a grand total of 20 names. Same idea. I'm a super easy marker. My job is not to make your life difficult. I want you guys to obtain this ilm as easy as possible, and I hope that it's practical in your everyday life to inspire people and as well as bring people to the truth of Islam. Allahumma ameen. I'm just gonna say, how should I say this? Better not to, just to kind of test yourself, but I'm not really gonna trick you. and there's only one or two questions, which they're not really trick questions. There's like one or two questions that if you're not really paying attention to the slides, you might mess up on. But why am I telling you that? Is because that means that those people who've taken this course before, the previous cohorts, almost everybody got like 90 something percent. So unless they were like completely out to lunch or they don't understand English or they just don't understand me, like I would say on average, like everybody was within like the 90% percentage range in terms of what they got on the exam. So just by looking at the slides alone is all you need to do. Just study ahead of time on your own, and don't be surprised if you easily get 95 or 100 with minimal effort. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته